Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Russia lashes out, striking targets across Ukraine.
There have been loud explosions in Ukraine's capital. The Air Force says its defense systems have been engaged in repelling a large-scale Russian attack. The mayor of Kyiv
We speak to an expert who says what happens in the coming weeks could determine how this war ends. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. On Monday, Russia launched a massive air attack on Ukraine, firing over 100 missiles and 100 drones. The strikes targeted Ukraine's energy grid, killing many civilians.
Like most of the previous Russian strikes, this one is also aimed at critical infrastructure in most of our regions, from Kharkiv and Kyiv to Odessa and our western regions.
President Zelensky then pleaded for support from allies to defend from attacks like these.
America, Britain, France, and other partners have the power to help us stop the terror. We need solutions.
He called it one of the largest attacks in a war that has escalated across multiple fronts since Ukraine's surprise invasion of Russia.
My name's Alex Gatopoulos. I'm defense editor for Al Jazeera English TV, and I'm in Kyiv in Ukraine.
So, Alex, the last time we spoke, the Ukrainian forces successfully pierced the Russian border into the Kursk region, and we were talking about it was a sneak attack. Russia was flummoxed. It clearly caught Russia completely off guard.
Russia's defense ministry says Ukraine has carried out air attacks on the border region of Kursk. That comes a day after Ukraine's largest ground incursion into Russian territory since the war in Ukraine began.
There was even some speculation back then that this was just to prove a point and that Ukraine might pull forces back across the border. Well, that certainly did not happen. Are these forces here to stay? What's the latest in Kursk?
They're certainly expanding, so the Ukrainian pocket is getting bigger and bigger. How they're going to treat this is still on the cards. I think part of the calculation matrix is just how the Russians are going to respond and just how heavily the Russians are going to respond. The whole idea of this incursion was to draw Russian troops away from Donbas, to try and thin that out, to try and slow down the momentum of their offensive there. And that hasn't happened. Russia has drawn troops from all over Russia, you name it. We have Marine infantry from as far away as the Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok. But they've been reinforced by paratroopers now, brought in from other areas of regiment brigade size, which is like 1,000 here, 3,000 there, but enough troops now, because Marines and paratroopers are disciplined troops. Now, President Zelensky has announced that the expansion is going on, and the pocket is increased by about 1 to 3 kilometers roughly per day.
We have a good progress today in the Kursk region. We have achieved our strategic goal.
But what we're seeing now, and this is where disciplined troops come in, is that when the Ukrainian forces surround them, if you were ill-disciplined, border guards, etc., maybe not trained as well, they would normally surrender. But now they're not. These troops, Marines and paratroopers, they're fighting their way out of the pockets, out of the encirclement. You know, when Ukraine attacks, more often than not, the attacks are being repelled, although maybe at great cost, but they're still being repelled. And Russia's brought up more artillery as well to try and stem the advance, and they're digging in. Now, digging in is a big deal. These complex defensive trenches, fortifications that were used very effectively to blunt the counteroffensive from Ukraine last year in the south. So we're seeing shades of that again also in Kursk. Now there's a huge battle there. Now again, this is going to be a problem for both sides because it starts off small, but then in order to be able to maintain the advance, you need to throw in more men, more supplies, tanks, vehicles. How long can you do that? How big a pocket can you create before it starts to implode on itself, because you just can't be everywhere all at once? So at some stage it will slow right down. They just can't maintain it forever. And they don't have the troops, they don't have the reserves, they being Ukraine.
And we've seen how effective defensive fortifications have been throughout this war. That's when things slow down. So it seems like things are grinding slowly to a standstill in Kursk. Now let's go back to Donbas, because as you mentioned, the conventional wisdom was that Russia would be so panicked by the Kursk invasion that it would divert resources to Kursk, slowing what had been a slow but pretty relentless advance into the Donbas. What's happening there?
This is the real fulcrum, the real focus point of the whole war at the moment. But we're talking tens of thousands of troops on either side, high tens, although they keep the numbers to themselves, but still they're throwing everything at it, both sides. Pokrovsk, which is key to Donetsk, has been evacuated. The evacuation came about a week ago.
Starting from August 20th, Donetsk regional authorities ordered mandatory evacuation of families with children here in Pokrovsk and nearby towns. The Russian military has been steadily grinding forward in Donetsk, one of 4 Ukrainian regions Moscow claims it has annexed.
It's being reinforced by Ukrainian units that are basically trying to hold on to the town because they have to hold on to this, and the Russians have to take it. And this, by the way, is industrial heartland, so very much factories, machine shops, industrial space. This is going to be a huge fight over the city itself because it's a crossroads, because it's a logistical hub. And their fighting is intensifying, and the Russians are advancing. Now, it might be slow. It might only be a few kilometers a day, but they are advancing slowly but surely.
Pokrovsk, why is that such a big deal? What happens if Russia takes that?
Pokrovsk is key to the defense of Donetsk and also its conquest. It's a crossroads, for highway crossroads. It's a logistical hub. All the roads lead in and out. And there are also train lines as well, that Russia's logistics depend massively, 80% plus, on railroads. So yes, it looks like the situation is precarious. In fact, some commentators, Ukrainian commentators, have called it critical now, that the Ukrainians have thrown units in to defend it. And by the way, Russia's ongoing offensive can't last forever. Offensives exhaust themselves. You run out of troops, they become exhausted quickly, you run out of material, you run out of artillery shells, you need to tend the wounded, fix the damaged tanks, etc., etc. There's a limit to how long you can maintain this momentum. This is one of the reasons why the Russians refuse to draw any troops or units away from there, because of this momentum that they have at the moment. So if they can keep it up, they can take Pokrovsk. But if the Ukrainians can keep defending it and push them and keep them where they are, they'll know that at some stage that the Russians within a month to 6 weeks will exhaust themselves. So this is very much about time as well as it is about space.
So is it fair to say it's so important, this victory in Pokrovsk, that it's actually not taking the bait that Ukraine sort of presented? It's not sending those reinforcements. In fact, it's more important than having troops occupying Russia. How surprising is that?
Well, it's surprising because this is the key part of the war. This is the key part of the invasion, the conquest of the Donbas. This is vital. The incursion into Kursk, I mean, you don't want to call it an invasion. And this is an aside that's important, by the way. Vladimir Putin cannot call it an invasion, a military invasion, because if he does, 2 things. He will have to declare martial law. He will have to admit that Russia's been invaded to his population, which will look sticky. You can get away with saying, oh, it's terrorists, although I don't know how many terrorists come in armored columns with heavy artillery, but still, he's calling it that at the moment. There's another angle to this that is, you have the CSTO, which is a Comprehensive Security Treaty Organization, which is Russia's version of NATO, to which Belarus and most of the stands are party to. And they are treaty obligated if one country is attacked or invaded to join in, to come in to help. So Belarus, maybe Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan might be drawn in to the war itself. Now, if that happens, then NATO has the uncomfortable decision to make whether it's going to sit by and let Ukraine be comprehensively destroyed, or join in. And therefore, suddenly, very quickly, you have two blocks at war with each other, with all the worries and attendant fears that that kind of mass warfare will bring, namely nuclear conflict. And that's the big, terrifying elephant in the room.
What impact could Ukraine's deployment of new long-range weapons have on the war's direction? That's after the break. So, Alex, there's a report in The Guardian that says Ukraine is seeking permission from Western allies to use long-range Storm Shadow missile strikes to go deep inside of Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also announced on Saturday a newly developed Ukrainian drone missile. This can take the war home. It's not just going to be Kursk. It could go right into the heartland. But again, then we start looking at how does that impact NATO? Are you concerned that this could escalate much further?
So there are two elements to this. One, my particular concern is the ignoring of Russian red lines is all very well, but at some stage, Russia's going to mean it. And if the West and Ukraine get used to the idea that, oh, we just ignore them, you may just ignore one that they really, really, really mean. Now, what they do to signal their intent may be, I don't know, I'll leave that to the imagination. But sooner or later, they have to make good on the red lines. Now, the second element to this is the long-range war. There are two wars going on. The one very much where armies are facing each other and battling it out. But the second one is the resource war. Now, this long-range war that Ukraine is also fighting. And at the moment, they're using Ukrainian drones. They just developed a long-range missile drone that was announced on Independence Day. That's got a 1,500 kilometer range, so it can do some damage. And they've been striking air bases and trying to destroy the jets and trying to move the jets back that launched these Russian glide bombs that have been causing so much havoc with Ukrainian units. So they've been doing that. And also, by the way, Ukraine is striking at Russia's industrial capacity to be able to wage war. So oil refineries, oil depots in Kavkaz, oil refineries in Rostov-on-Don, they hit it. The refinery burned for 6 days, and then they hit it again just to make sure that the fire wasn't going out anytime soon. So that's not producing any oil anytime soon. And these things are vital to produce kerosene, aviation fuel, diesel, all the things that you need to be able to run an army. And also deep inside, petrochemical plants, plants that produce artificial rubber, all these things, that are the strategic materials that a country needs to be able to fight an industrial level war, are being targeted and attacked.
Really, really leveling the playing field here. Okay, so we've talked about the military side. Let's talk about the diplomatic side. Ukrainian President Zelensky said negotiations were continuing with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Switzerland on a second summit for peace. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine exchanged 115 prisoners of war from each other on Saturday.
The look said it all. 115 Ukrainian prisoners swapped for an equal number of Russians. The joy at their release written all over their faces. This prisoner says he can't believe it. He can't believe he's here and has called his wife.
Anything you can read into this in terms of a possible diplomatic breakthrough ahead? Do you think this could help explain why there's this furious rush by the Russians to continue with this Donbas invasion while they still can?
For several reasons, military and diplomatic. If you're going to negotiate a peace, eventually, you want to take as much territory beforehand to be able to have as many playing cards as you've got in your deck. Diplomatically, the Gulf states have played key roles here, as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, trying to negotiate indirect settlements, trying to negotiate a cessation of strikes on each other's energy infrastructure. In Kyiv, we saw strikes on electricity, strikes on water, parts of the city are without power, same thing with Odessa. So, I mean, the prisoner exchange isn't the first by any means. It's welcome, obviously, but these have been ongoing pretty much throughout the war now in various amounts. What was interesting is the visit by Narendra Modi recently to Ukraine. He'd been to Russia. He was criticized for that, but he's also explained Russia is a major client state. We have had relations with Russia going back decades. In fact, before Russia was Russia and it was the Soviet Union, the vast majority of the military equipment that India uses is Russian, forms the backbone of its air force, and most of its tanks. And by the way, Narendra Modi was welcomed in Ukraine by Zelensky.
Smiles and handshakes as India's leader is welcomed in Kyiv by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday, just weeks after bear hugs with the Russian president in Moscow.
And Zelensky seemed to understand that, Narendra Modi is friends with both, and therefore, by the way, is in an able position to be able to act as honest broker, to act as a mediator. And those indirect talks that you just talked about earlier as well, involving Turkey, Qatar, Saudi as well, President Zelensky has intimated that he would be happy if Narendra Modi was leading these talks, or certainly India.
Wow.
So yes, a lot going on behind the scenes at the moment.
Big picture on the Kursk invasion and the state of the war. You've been watching this from every angle. When the history is written, will this be considered a bold gambit that turned the tide of the war, or a desperate diversionary tactic that left the Ukrainian heartland exposed? Or is this recency bias and we're overreacting to the significance of now?
That's a really good question. I think it's probably going to be a little bit of both. It is desperate. It is bold. But what's going to become of it? If it becomes meat grinder 2.0 and you just grind down each other's forces, it's going to benefit no one. If you exhibit some tactical flexibility and talent and you can actually make the Russians suffer, and while still retaining your forces relatively intact, take some land, maybe to trade with, maybe to act as a buffer zone, and do that at a much greater cost to your opponent, then it's a success. But if you suffer greatly in the process, then it's going to be a zero-sum game. So I think we'll only know that answer, not as much in hindsight, but we really have to see how the conflict there escalates and see what happens, how Ukraine plays it, whether they pull back or they go all in.
Wow. Yeah. Look, I mean, what happens in Donbas in the next few weeks really is going to make a big difference, because you combine the fact that Ukraine now occupies territory in Russia, combined with the long-range capability. Ukraine suddenly has some pretty good leverage in a negotiation, and that wasn't the case a month ago.
Very much so. And again, also, by the way, Belarus is another wild card here. Do they come in on the wall? There has been saber rattling on the borders. They accused Ukraine of having 120,000 troops on the border. Ukraine says our military disposition has not changed whatsoever. The idea that they have 120,000 troops sitting there idle, but meanwhile they're suffering in the Donbas and being forced back, doesn't sound particularly likely. But Ukraine has turned around and said, Belarus, you have units of armor, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, engineering units, special forces and artillery, exactly the mix needed for offensive military action, and you're moving them to our border. Now, Belarus has said, no, this is only defensive, but let's see, because the entry of Belarus into the war would have tremendous unforeseen consequences, especially for Ukraine, obviously, where it would now suddenly fight a war on two fronts. Is that likely? We don't know, because obviously, again, we have the possibility of escalating this and drawing in NATO, which no one wants. So yeah, high-stakes poker game.
Alex Gatopoulos, thank you so much for coming on The Take and all the great reporting you're doing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Khaled Soltan and Tamara Khandaker, with Duha Mosaad, Hagir Saleh, Shraddha Joshi, and me, Kevin Hirten, in for Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer. And Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.